Do you ever feel like you're running in place? That's exactly how I felt when it came to learning English listening. For years, I worked hard. I memorized vocabulary, studied grammar until I could recite the rules in my sleep, and passed every written test thrown my way. Yet, when it came to actually listening to English, I was stuck, completely stuck. Why was it so hard? Why did the words sound so different when they were spoken compared to when I saw them written? Why could others understand so easily while I struggled to even catch a phrase? If you've ever asked yourself those questions, then maybe my story will sound familiar. The wall I couldn't climb. It started in my English class. We were doing a listening exercise. One of those pre-recorded conversations between two overly cheerful voices. I pressed the headphones to my ears, trying to catch every word, but they spoke so fast, too fast. Words blurred together like a waterfall, and I couldn't grasp anything. "Anna," my teacher called out. "What did they just say?" I froze. My mind was blank. I had no idea what to say, so I muttered something vague and hoped it was close enough. It wasn't. My teacher moved on, but the shame stayed with me. I felt like everyone else could understand except for me. At home, I thought I'd try another approach. Maybe I'll just watch movies without subtitles. I told myself, confident that immersion would be the key. I turned on a popular film, settled into my chair, and prepared to soak it all in. But within 5 minutes, I was rewinding every scene. Words zipped by before I could even identify them, and phrases sounded like a blur of sound. I paused, sighed, and switched the subtitles back on. In that moment, a question haunted me. What if I'll never understand English? A new beginning, starting over. I was ready to give up, but something inside me refused to let go. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe it was hope. Either way, I decided to try one last thing, going back to basics. One day, while wandering through a bookstore, I stumbled across a children's section. Bright covers, bold text, and pictures of animals filled the shelves. I picked up a book and flipped through it. The sentences were short and simple. The cat is sleeping. The sun is shining. I bought it. At home, I read it out loud, slowly. It felt a little silly, an adult reading a book meant for 5-year-olds, but for the first time, I didn't feel overwhelmed. I looked up the words I didn't know, wrote them down in a notebook, and practiced pronouncing them. With every page, my confidence grew, brick by brick. To build on that, I started using flashcards. Every day, I'd add 5 or 10 new words, and review them during lunch breaks, or before bed. I'd test myself, whispering the words quietly, and imagining how they might sound in a sentence. It wasn't fast progress, it wasn't glamorous, but it worked. Every new word was a brick, and I was slowly building a foundation that felt sturdy for the first time. Still, there was a question that lingered in my mind. Would this ever be enough? Could I really understand spoken English? Or was I just delaying the inevitable? The turning point. Eventually, I decided it was time to face my fear again, but this time, I approached listening differently. Instead of passively letting words fly over my head, I engaged. I started with short podcasts, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, nothing too overwhelming. I'd listen to one sentence at a time, pause, and write down what I thought I heard. Then I'd rewind and check. If I got it wrong, I'd try again. At first, it was painfully slow. I felt like I was dissecting every word, every syllable. But something unexpected happened. I started to hear patterns. Words that used to sound like a blur began to separate into individual sounds. To keep myself motivated, I turned it into a game. Before unpausing the podcast, I'd try to predict what the speaker would say next. Sometimes I was right, sometimes I was hilariously wrong, but either way, I was listening. And for the first time, I started to believe, maybe I can do this. Immersing myself with that spark of hope, I started to push myself further. I picked a Netflix show I loved and watched it, with subtitles. At first, I leaned heavily on the text, but over time, I found myself relying less on the words on screen, and more on the voices. I also joined an online language exchange. Let me tell you, my first session was nerve-wracking. My hands were sweaty, my heart was racing, and I almost logged out before it even started. But when I introduced myself, and the other participants smiled warmly, I realized something important. It's okay to make mistakes. Talking to people from different countries gave me exposure to all kinds of accents, and I realized that understanding English wasn't about perfection, it was about connection. The breakthrough. Months later, I had my first real breakthrough. I was preparing for a presentation at work, a task that would have terrified me before. I practiced in front of a mirror, rehearsing every word. When the day came, I delivered my presentation, and while it wasn't flawless, it was mine. People listened, nodded, and asked questions. For the first time, I didn't feel like an outsider trying to catch up. I felt like I belonged. The journey continues. Looking back, I realize that understanding English wasn't just about learning a language. It was about patience, persistence, and self-belief. There are still moments when I struggle an unfamiliar accent, a slang word I've never heard before, but now I know it's not impossible. It's just another step on the journey. And maybe that's the point. Learning isn't a destination. It's a path you keep walking, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. So if you're feeling stuck, I want you to know, you're not alone. Start small, build your foundation, celebrate the little victories, and most importantly, keep going. Because one day, you'll look back and realize how far you've come, just like I did.